There are a lot of fundamental questions about immigration and refugee policy that neither get asked by the left wing nor the right wing. I was in a classroom not too long ago with a professor whom I would characterize as having a left-wing extremist position on these issues. And, she would say positive things about the situation for Cambodian refugees in California or in Canada. She would make her argument that unlimited numbers of these people should be allowed to stay for unlimited amounts of time, that anything else was literally a crime against humanity, that it was a violation of their human rights to ask them under any circumstances to return to Cambodia, even if they had committed serious crimes, such as joining a gang, getting involved with drug dealing and murder. Those were case studies we were studying in that class. So she was directly commenting on this, that it was a crime against humanity to ask a refugee to return to Cambodia decades after the war had ended there, decades after they've had peace and stability and rapid economic growth. I would raise questions that had simply never arisen before, that were shockingly original to her, such as, well, your position, is it really what's best for Cambodia? She'd never thought about that. Her left-wing position, she only thought in terms of, can't even say Canada's self-interest, in terms of this assumption that the role of the Western world is to receive and absorb infinite numbers of refugees and migrants, the more the merrier, and to point to often very incoherent economic arguments that this creates more jobs, that this is economically positive for Western countries, whether you're talking about England or Canada or Germany or what have you. And if you just ask something as simple as that, well, is that what's economically good for Cambodia? They're stumped. And this is a lifelong specialist. This is someone with a PhD someone who goes to international conferences on these issues. And she had absolutely never looked at the issue from that perspective. This is not the only example of a debate I had with her during that semester. I did a lot of the talking. It was a year-long symposium. So the students were supposed to be talking for several hours, but very few of the students had anything to say, aside from myself, and very few had the self-confidence to stand up to a frankly hysterical left-wing extremist professor on those issues. But I did have a lot to say, and not all of it in disagreement with her, but very, very often so. It's easy to get a white Western liberal to recognize that brain drain is a problem. Brain drain, for example, a small country like Jamaica, generation after generation, has its most highly educated people running away to work in Toronto. And Toronto benefits from it. Now, you may be a left-wing liberal who simply wants to celebrate this and say, isn't it great that Toronto has a big Jamaican community? I used to live just down the street from a huge Jamaican community in Toronto, with Jamaicans on one side and Brazilian Portuguese on the other. I grew up in an intensely multicultural society. But if you simply ask, oh, but is this good for Jamaica? What are the impacts for Jamaica? Already you've shifted the nature of the conversation in a very fundamental way. Now, the economic arguments in favor of unlimited labor mobility, unlimited acceptance of new immigrants, unlimited acceptance of new refugees, they tend to distract you from the parasitic role this puts wealthy Western countries in. Why is it so economically productive for Canada to have nurses arrive and work in Canada from the Philippines being a much poorer country? Well, the government of Canada doesn't have to pay for their education. The government of Canada doesn't have to pay for their health care during their birth and early years of life. The government of Canada doesn't have to pay for their retirement benefits. They get, in effect, from the government's perspective, in terms of the public purse, Canada is in a parasitic relationship to the Philippines. And we are siphoning off a lot of their most highly educated, most upwardly mobile people to come and contribute to our economy instead of the Philippines economy. So again, this is a problem for Jamaica. This is a problem for the Philippines. This is a problem for Cambodia. This is a fundamental problem in the nature of how labor markets link the first world to the third world, right? And refugee policy only makes it more extreme. Singapore is a very wealthy country. I mean, certainly by Asian standards, by international standards also. In principle, under our 1951 United Nations Convention on Refugee Policy, every single homosexual in Singapore, homosexual, lesbian, etc., has the right to immediately relocate to Canada and live in Canada in perpetuity, permanently, because they are refugees, because the government of Singapore persecutes them as refugees. They do not have sufficient human rights in Singapore. And we could also choose Saudi Arabia as an example. Okay? So Canada could very easily absorb all of the homosexuals from Singapore. We have a big country, and we're also, I mean, culturally, in terms of the level of education, it's much, much easier for a Singaporean refugee to integrate into Canada's economy than it is for an Afghanistan refugee or what have you, or a Cambodian. And I just got to say, I'm choosing examples here so far where I actually, if anything, have a positive bias towards them. I rather like Singaporeans. I rather like Cambodians. I used to live in Cambodia myself, and so on. It's not the case that I'm against Cambodians living in Canada. I'm really questioning the fundamental assumptions that are basically unchallenged today by the entire establishment, whether neoliberal, neoconservative, or indeed left-wing extremists. They all share a fundamental set of assumptions that I think are fundamentally wrong. Is it in Singapore's best interest for all of these dissidents, all of these people who might, as artists, as intellectuals, as political leaders, challenge and change Singapore's government? Is it in Singapore's interest for all of them to escape to Canada, to form an émigré community, a refugee suburb of Toronto? Do we want to do that with the whole world? Because those are the laws we have in the books right now. Now, there are other factors in selecting who actually makes that trip and who doesn't. With the Syrian refugee crisis, the average refugee, as I recall, was earning about $2,000 per year. Now, again, this is partly because the value of those earnings would be much, much greater in the local economy than when they're converted into US dollars and made to buy foreign services. The cost of getting on a smuggler's boat to try to make the crossing from Syria to Europe was about $6,000 on average, US dollars. Okay? So you're not getting a random sample of Syrian refugees arriving in France or Germany or Italy or Greece or what have you. All right? You are not getting a random sampling of Cambodians who turn up in Canada. You're not getting a random sampling of Laotians. You're not getting a random sampling of Burmese refugees. Those are all groups I've known face-to-face. Those are languages I've studied and spoken to varying extents. They're people I've interviewed face-to-face, refugees from those communities. These are things I was really interested in for many, many years. And they're things I've read about in formal reports, studies, research, what have you. So many countries. If anything, I'm positively biased in these examples I'm choosing. But the policies we have in place are still disastrous, and they're disastrous for the people themselves. If the Canadian government wanted to help refugees from Myanmar, Burma, whatever you want to say, you can set up and operate a camp right on the edge of Burma, on the Thai-Burmese border, on any of the other borders, and provide those people with food and shelter and medical care that doesn't divorce them from their native language, their native economy, their native society, and leaves them poised in a place to move back to their homeland the minute political conditions allow it. And of course, that is the traditional refugee internment camp, such as now surrounds Syria. I mean, Jordan and Lebanon and what have you. If you have this humanitarian impulse to help refugees, that's where you do it, as close to the crisis as possible, and all the while enabling those people to militate for political change, to remain a part of the social networks of family. You know, again, if you divorce people, even from the family they grew up in, whether it's in Cambodia or Singapore or Syria, force them to learn a totally new language and force them to join your economy at the lowest rung. I mean, this misrepresentation that you're really helping people by recruiting them into being, illiterate hotel cleaners in California. I remember reading one account of a Cambodian refugee who was shuffled off to do the lowest level of factory labor in New Zealand. You know, he didn't speak a word of English. He was put in an airplane and found himself in this alien country speaking an alien language, and he was earning okay money. He was set up with a job by the New Zealand government, by the refugee board, working in a working in a factory. He was resentful as hell. He didn't regard it positively. He regarded it as a pretty awful experience. He was made into a member of the oppressed proletariat that the left wing are supposed to care about, right? Recruiting Cambodian refugees and Syrian refugees and what have you into the lowest rung of your economy as a developed Western nation to be exploited in a society that they don't really understand, in a legal system they don't really understand, where they don't have the same rights, they don't even have the same ability to complain that someone born and raised in the cultures. This is not a morally good thing in the simple way that the left wing represents it to be. Now, whether or not they can even find employment is another matter. I just saw a statistic that I believe I think it was 86%. Yeah, 86% of the Afghan refugees in Germany never found employment, remained permanently employed while they were there. So as from memory, but anyway, I did just see that stat recently. Many of them, of course, failed to find employment and failed to integrate if integrators what they wanted to do. But again, the purpose of refugee policy under the 1951 UN Convention wasn't to integrate people. It wasn't to employ them in your factories. It wasn't to employ them mopping the floors of a hotel lobby. The point of refugee policy was to provide refuge. And that really is a high and pure moral cause that governments of the world ought to care passionately about. But again, if you want to provide refuge, really think about the meaning of the word refuge. Refuge is not an airplane ticket to Los Angeles. It's not. Refuge really is setting up a camp with medical care and food and shelter and education for children right on the Syrian border, right on the Cambodian border, right on the Burmese border, wherever the crisis is that people are fleeing from, right? And it's providing them with that refuge so that they can return to that society, and so they still remain engaged with that society. And their prospects in terms of their employment, their education, their language, the point is not to assimilate them into Western society. That's ultimately a very strange kind of capitalist predatory behavior of, hey, let's set up a bunch of recruitment camps around the world so that the poorest and poorest and weakest, most helpless people can be recruited to be less than minimum wage laborers in Western countries. And the way they're recruited, the criteria they're selected by is bizarre. Now, of course, when you leave the selection up to, instead, we're going to recruit refugees on the basis of whoever can pay the most in bribes to illegal, human smuggling rings, the results you get are even worse. But of course, that's not the case with an example like Singapore. It wouldn't be the case with homosexuals fleeing from Saudi Arabia either. If every homosexual in Singapore flees to Canada, which they have the right to do, and it's not a hypothetical example. We do have homosexuals in Canada who are Singaporean citizens who came as refugees for this reason, which is a fascinating case study again. Okay? They transform Singapore by their absence. They have subtracted themselves from the social struggle in a way that has tremendous long-term consequences. There have been periods of ethnic cleansing in Myanmar where the government of Myanmar was basically trying to exterminate a whole ethnic group of people. Should Canada, en masse, receive those people into Canada, find them factory employment or other minimum wage or worse than minimum wage, and integrate them into Canadian society? Believe it or not, we would then be participating in genocide. We would be assisting the government of Myanmar in making that ethnic group disappear. Really think about it. That's not refuge. And I know you may think it's helping them. Yes, on a person-to-person basis, they will thank you. They will say, wow, I'm so happy I now have this apartment in Canada instead of either being homeless or fleeing into the jungle or being in a refugee. I recognize that. But you have to think about the meaning and purpose of refugee law and how it's supposed to help the countries these people are fleeing from. All right? You're not going to help a persecuted ethnic minority by wiping them out of the history of the country they're fleeing from. And you're not going to help homosexuals militate to transform the society they're fleeing from, whether that's Saudi Arabia or Singapore, by, in this sense, giving them refuge, where we don't mean refuge. We mean immigration with a mask put on it. We mean integration and assimilation into a totally foreign society and totally foreign economy for reasons that have nothing to do with helping that cause or helping those people or helping the future of that country. All right? Now, my heart goes out to anyone who's bothered to engage in this debate. One of the things I said my first day in that class was that I felt that this was a black box issue, this was an issue, black boxes and images comes from aircraft. This was an issue that in a democratic society, we had proved we were incapable of debating. We were proved we were incapable of discussing publicly. And so democracies had basically taken up undemocratic positions on this issue. Most Western democracies have a more or less covert system of points for how they select who becomes an immigrant, who becomes a refugee, and what benefits they received. And this is kept out of the public's attention and kept away from parliamentary decision-making to the greatest extent possible because it's extremely odious. At the end of the day, we literally have Christian missionaries standing around in a refugee camp in Myanmar selecting who's going to live and who's going to die. It's really odious, and nobody wants to think about it. Again, whether it's Myanmar or Africa, I'm using examples I'm more familiar with. And we do have situations where we have oppressed groups within Canada who are in much, much worse conditions than refugees who have arrived from foreign countries. I met and interviewed a family from Myanmar. So they were a persecuted ethnic minority, so they're not Burmese, but they're from Myanmar. And they were in Canada. And they had lived there long enough to know, in the part of Canada I was living in Saskatchewan, the most hated ethnic group, the group that had to face the most racism from taxi drivers and employers and everything aside, were our native people, the Cree, the Ojibwe, the Dene, with several other groups there, but our First Nations, our American Indians, as Americans would say, right? And I was asking them, their whole story, how they got selected, how from the camp, put on an airplane, ended up in Canada, and of what benefits they were getting. They were getting real benefits handed out to them by the Canadian government. They were getting free education and a free house. The government of Canada literally gave them a house in downtown Regina, the capital of the province, where, of course, they had access to education and employment and all these benefits, but the house was free. Right? Now, not only is it the case that native-born Canadians do not get these amazing social services that were given to these Burmese migrants for reasons they couldn't explain themselves. They themselves puzzled at it. They sat there and talked about it. And they said, "Yeah, it's a strange system, isn't it?" You had to look across the train tracks to the situation of our own native people, our indigenous people, and the terrible struggle they've been in to have any land of their own, to have any access to education or opportunity or employment of their own. And I asked these refugees face to face in this interview, I said, well, how do you feel about the fact that we have poor people here? We have poor native people who've been here for thousands of years before there were any white people in this country. And our government doesn't give them the opportunity that they gave to you. The government gave you better opportunities, better benefits than we ever give our own native people. If we handed out free houses in the capital cities of our country to our native people, instead of doing what we did to them over the last 50 years, if we gave them the benefits of a refugee policy over a period of 50 years, their whole socioeconomic position in the country would be fundamentally different, radically, indescribably different from what it is today in Canada. Right? Some of you know what I'm talking about, some of you don't. And it was a really strange moment to sit there with this person who benefited so much from the largesse of Canadian refugee policy and hear him just say sadly, I don't know, I don't understand it. It makes no sense. Okay? So even the people who benefit most from this have to sit there sadly and say, yeah, this is really kind of a twisted lottery that doesn't make any sense. Now, the other concerns that are expressed by both the traditional left and the traditional right, some of them I do share. Having next-door neighbors who are Cambodian or Laotian, both being Buddhist cultures or majority Buddhist cultures, is not the same as having neighbors from Afghanistan or Saudi Arabia. It's not. There are differences. Having neighbors who are Chinese is not the same as having neighbors who are Iraqi. It's not. There's no point in pretending that it's the same simply because they may all legally fall under the heading of refugees, or they may all legally fall under the heading of migrants, of immigrant policy, right? One of the things that haunts me most about this, in a country the size of Canada, is that you see the people in our own government don't have any of the expertise they need to handle these issues. They don't know Laos and Laotian culture and the Laotian language the way I do. They don't know Cambodia the way I do. And, if you just spend a little bit of time, and I spent years doing research on this stuff, the people who were chosen to come back from those conflicts, they're not normal people. They're not an average or cross-section of the Laotian population or the Cambodian population. Disproportionately, They're people who rolled up their sleeves and did killing for us, meaning the CIA. You know that if you just spent some time hanging out at Laotian Buddhist temples in Canada, the political profile of who came back, and it's still talked about in a kind of coded way on CBC radio, you know, a large number of these refugees being resettled from Afghanistan are people who were translators or assistants or mercenaries or killers who worked with the American side, who worked with the Canadian side in our decade-long conflict in Afghanistan, right? So it's not a random selection. And again, this gets at a fundamental ethical problem of the meaning of refuge itself. Refuge is not supposed to be a reward for military service, right? It's not supposed to be integration into Canada for everyone who proved they were willing to kill on behalf of the CIA or do the translation work on behalf of the CIA or whatever their job was in America's never-ending wars overseas. And again, those people transform their country by their absence. The fact that we take away from Jamaica and the Philippines and all these other countries their most highly educated people, and in many cases, the people who are most inclined to be dissidents, the people who are most inclined to militate for real cultural and political change, to transform the societies they're from. We are transforming those societies in a different way. We're changing the fate and future of those countries by integrating those people into the suburbs of Toronto instead of leaving them to work for a better and brighter future in their own country. And of course, we are in a very real sense neglecting the opportunity and I think the moral obligation to present meaningful economic development and opportunity to oppressed and downtrodden groups within Canada, such as our First Nations. We situation in Victoria where we had Filipino immigrants being brought in to work just at a donut shop and a coffee shop. And the newspapers started complaining about it because when you look at the actual laws, the laws are supposed to prevent that. We're not supposed to be bringing in unskilled labor for that level of job. We're supposed to be giving those jobs to Canadians. And there are elements of racism and there are elements of authoritarianism in the workplace, to put it that way. The fact of the matter is that most Canadian employers who might own a small donut shop or coffee shop, they know that if they bring over a Filipino who just barely speaks English and doesn't know how to exercise their rights, they're going to be an almost silent and unquestioning employee. And it would be a very different challenge of employer to employee to go out and recruit people from a native reservation, to go out and recruit people who've born and raised in Canada, know their rights, and have some sense of the dignity in the workplace they deserve and what have you, right? So, the concept of providing refuge to people in need is so morally pure that nobody wants to question it. And yet, if you actually go and visit a refugee camp, it's filthy and hopeless and sordid. And don't even get me started. I could talk for another 30 minutes on this. And if you look at the actual system of how people are selected out of those camps and end up being integrated into Canadian society, that's even more disturbing. So we have a situation, I'm going to say it's a black box situation, where I think nobody on the left and nobody on the right wanted to really look at how these systems work and what the implications are for destination countries or source countries in immigration or refugee policy. Nobody wanted to take responsibility for it. And on the contrary, what has emerged is a really insincere economic rationale, which is simply that accepting refugees increases GDP or accepting new immigrants increases GDP. This is true, but simply having more human beings increases GDP, right? This is really fallacious reasoning. And I've heard that presented at London School of Economics lectures with no sense of humor to an audience where I think 90% of the people in the audience know just how insincere it is to say, oh, well, more migrants and more refugees means more GDP, therefore it's justified. This is actually a completely fallacious argument. But it's true, too, that the basic standards and practices of refugee policy emerged after the shock of the Holocaust, as it's called. The big UN declaration is 1951, the main policy on that. in the post-World War II period, they were really just thinking of a circumstance such as the rise and fall of the Nazi Empire, which was brief, and of populations like the Jews of Europe that were being persecuted, but that were almost an invisible minority within Europe, who could as easily move from Germany to Denmark and be a part of that economy and so on, who could escape persecution, and then after the presumed oppressive regime collapses in a few years, go back again. Okay? This was never thought of, this was never conceived of, the issues were never thought through on a global scale, and it was neither thought through in terms of what is the benefit for destination countries such as Canada, nor what really is in the interest for source countries, whether that's Singapore, Saudi Arabia, or Cambodia.